Brumfield has the rare distinction of being at once a scholar, a philologist, and a scholar of Russian architecture, as well as an archivist and an agent of memory, of preservation of the stratum of decaying, deteriorating architectural legacy of Russia, dating back to certainly the late Middle Ages. For the last 30 years, Professor Brumfield has been traveling the length and breadth of Russia on every imaginable surface, paved and unpaved, taking often his life in hand to reach distant places and to record this legacy of architecture, doing the work that the Russians themselves were either incapable of doing or not able to do because of financial constraints. And for his work has resulted in nearly 100 articles in an ongoing series documenting architectural treasures throughout Russia, in a number of authoritative books, including Gold and Azure, which was the first comprehensive study of Russian architecture. Exhibits, he has lectured and his work is at the Smithsonian, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at MoMA, and of course in Russia as well. So I think you didn't come here to listen to me, but to listen to Professor Brumfield. So he is speaking today, as you see, a memory commemoration, and memorialization. And I would like you to join me in welcoming Bill back to read. Thank you. So turn down the light.
Yeah, I think you could. It's a pleasure to be back. The lecture that I'm going to give today has to deal with a topic that I find very emotional. And it's one that's grown on me over the decades as I've been photographing Russia from one end to the other. I've often noticed the war memorials and even the smallest Russian villages, sometimes very modest, unpretentious memorials with the names of the local people who died during that conflict. Sometimes the memorials are huge, dwarfing anything that I've ever seen in the large cities. But every place has its memory of this enormous conflict, which began with the launching of Operation Barbarossa by Hitler's Wehrmacht on June the 22nd, 1941. The first months, as you know, were one of continuous German success. Germans, after all, had defeated the major armies of Europe, France, and Britain. Britain held on gamely through its navy and air force, but the Germans had their way wherever they chose to fight in terms of the land war, and that's what really counted. And the invasion of Russia seemed to be another story in that gruesome and terrifying onslaught. The Germans surrounded huge Russian forces at Minsk, at Kiev, the capital of present-day Ukraine, moved on in early October. The Russians somewhere, Soviet forces, stoutly resisted, and that gave much-needed time. But basically, they, like every other army of that period, did not know how to deal with the best army in the world, the Wehrmacht, the army of the Third Reich. There's been much criticism of Soviet failures, but remember, no one else knew how to deal with that force. Finally, through an enormous expenditure of territory and blood, the defense was cobbled together on the gates of Moscow, and in November-December 1941, the Soviet army inflicted the first major strategic defeat on Hitler's forces. There's much yet to be done. Many millions of lives are still to be claimed in this campaign, but that moment was critical. But before that moment, it was uncertain as to what would happen. The Americans were coming in through Lend-Lease for the Roosevelt administration, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th turned us into from a de facto to a treaty ally of the Soviet Union when Hitler declared war on the United States on December 9th. But at that point, it was still unclear as to how the tide would be turned. Now, going over this terrain that I'm showing you here on the gates of Moscow from Smolensk, which was a great German victory, although the Russians really played for time here and held the Germans for over a month. They moved to this area called Vyazma. And going over this territory 2 summers ago, it suddenly struck me what a terrible and terrifying moment that this was. A moment of despair, of panic, of chaos, of isolated bravery. No one understood how this force could be stopped. And what I'm going to talk about today is different stages in which the Russians have come to terms with those losses, catastrophic losses, millions of people, during 1941 and 42. What I find most interesting, as you will see in the lecture, is the way the Russian Orthodox Church is now moving into that process of commemoration. Germany is now a valuable ally of Russia. Contemporary Germany is a great positive force in Europe. One doesn't want to raise issues, once again, open old wounds. The church in its way, and one can be skeptical of their motives, but the church in its way evades or sidesteps direct political questions by commemorating the extraordinary losses of those first months of the war. The church somehow sees it as an exaltation, the souls given to the higher cause. Now, I should say right now that very few of the people who died in that war were practicing Orthodox Christians. During Stalinist Russia, that would be a complete impossibility. Furthermore, many of the people buried in these mass graves were Jewish soldiers. They were also Muslim soldiers from the Central Asian part of the Soviet Union. So that is something to be borne in mind, but the church sees all of these sacrifices, believers or non-believers, Christians, Jews, Muslims, or in the overwhelming majority of people with no religious affiliation. All of that is a part of the Russian sacrifice, just as the Russians, according to the Russian concept, had sacrificed themselves to save Europe from the Tatar invasion in the 15th century, the Mongol invasion. So this is a part of an overarching myth of Russia's role in civilization. The Russians offer themselves as sacrifices. Those sacrifices now can be exalted by the church as a sacred memory. So we'll trace that process over my lecture. We'll be talking primarily about the area between Vyazma and just to the west of Moscow. There's a village called Dubasekova. And then we'll go back to the north of Vyazma and look at the new church memorial that is evolving in this area. So we're going to be going in something of a chronological direction in terms of a concept of memorialization, but we're going to be moving in a slightly against chronology in terms of the historical events of the period. Let's start with Vyazma, which was the site of an enormous encirclement in April of 1942. So we're starting, there's already been the victory at the gates of Moscow, but the Germans are still close. The Russians were not yet capable of coordinating the forces and the reserves, and they made some ghastly mistakes. The Germans, as we later know, plunged towards Stalingrad, which would be the ultimate turning point of the war. So it was still very much in the balance. And the catastrophes of the early 1942 have been memorialized in this secular monument to General Mikhail Yefremov. And what is extraordinary about this, and I really discovered it in August of 2012, this monument was erected by one of Russia's greatest, best-known sculptors, Evgeny Vucetich, author of the great Stalingrad Memorial, which some of you perhaps have seen with the upraised figure of Mother Russia, the motherland calls. But that monument was in the 1970s. It's gargantuan, outsized form. But this is a statue from 1946. Vyazma, which had been first raked with fire in the fall of 41. Again, in the encirclement, the attempt to push the Germans back in the spring of 42. And yet again, a third time, when the Red Army finally retook it in the spring of 1943. There was nothing left of the town. 90% of the buildings had been destroyed. 1946, Stalin, could have been done without his knowledge, commissions this monument to General Yefremov. Who was he? He's commander of the 33rd Army, which had fought valiantly at the gates of Moscow, and over his objections, that decimated army, which only had slightly over 10,000 troops left. An entire army with only 10,000, that's a division. It's not even a corps. This army was pushed back into the fray of the fight, and exhausted, with no proper medical treatment. They were pushed back into Vyazma in an attempt to force the Germans farther away from Moscow. They were surrounded. Most of the army was destroyed. A few managed to get out. General Yefremov, at the last moment, his wife, who served as a nurse, he first shot her and then shot himself. Suicide. The German commander gave full military burial on the site of his death in Vyazma. When the Russians recaptured his body, they reburied it in Vyazma itself. Why would Stalin, in 1946, commemorate a disaster? And how superbly he commemorates it. The statue is in the best tradition of heroic French military monuments. You all know the monument to Marshal Ney in Paris. Well, it's romantic, emotional, a desperate expression of bravery. You can see General Yefremov with his hand pointed toward the west, as though stopping the invader, and he's surrounded by four of his troops, surrounded, as they were surrounded, and they are in various stages. There's one with the famous Spagin automatic gun. He's firing, another ready. You see how he links them together. Superb monument in the style of 19th century French military architecture. And we might note right here in the preceding slide, we can just stop here for a minute. You notice 1946, it was actually created by people who were working on a gargantuan project called the Palace of the Soviets on the site of the destroyed Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer. It was a huge monument meant to be capped by an equally huge monument to Lenin. Stalin, no way, in 1946, he was going to commemorate Lenin. So the people who were working on it gradually were shifted to other jobs. And you can see on the base of the pedestal that stonework was done by people who worked for the Dvorets Sovetov, the Palace of Soviets project. Fascinating insight into the Stalinist commemorative project right there. And Vucetich's name is over there in the left lower part of the base. Now if we go to the other parts, you can see the way the figures, the five figures are linked together. If we go over to the front, it's the desperate face of the soldier in the shaggy fur vest holding the pistol. And here we have the wounded soldier grasping toward General Yefremov, his head lifted up, the soldier, what I would call, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," that denoted of the martyrdom of the commander, is the emotional peak of this statue. You can see the way they all surround their general, their leader, who was incapable of extricating them from this terrible catastrophe in which most of them died. I have my own theory as to why this was placed there, because Zhukov has widely been blamed, as though Zhukov could have done very much about it. for the sending Yefremov into this area in 1946. Zhukov was in very deep trouble with Stalin. Perhaps it was a oblique reproach. But these are political issues, we won't dwell on that. But this is sort of the high point of the state commemoration of the terrible sacrifices that first year, 1941, 1942. It was built, erected in 1946 in a still smoldering city. Well, the ruins were already beginning to be recreated, but I think largely the city was still destroyed when this monument was placed there. Extraordinary gestures, there's really nothing else like it anywhere in the Soviet Union. So in itself, a fascinating insight. Now, if we go to the next stage, we get closer to Moscow. Let's go to Duboseko. Here we're talking about the early part of early part of October 1941. The Germans have just blasted the entire force outside of Vyazma, in the Vyazma encirclement of October 1941. Remember, Yefremov died in April of 1942 trying to retake Vyazma, but Vyazma was encircled in October 1941 and looked as though there was nothing to stand between the Germans and Moscow in what was called Operation Typhoon. Nonetheless, defensive groups were cobbled together. At one point, there were only a few tens of thousands of people stopping the Germans' way. Zhukov managed to bring new divisions in from Siberia, and the miracle was effected, at an enormous cost. That cost was commemorated by a story that was published in December 1941 in the Russian Army newspaper, Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, talked about the 28 Panfilovцы. These were people who served in the division of General Panfilov, who himself was shortly to die. And they gave their lives stopping a column of German tanks by tying the grenades around their waist and throwing themselves, in a sense, sacrificing themselves to stop the onslaughts. Mass heroism was the term that was used at that period. And this was an invigorating, inspiring moment, and particularly the words of one of the sergeant of this detachment. Россия велика, за нами Москва. Russia is great. Behind us is Moscow. We have nowhere to retreat. Every school child knows those words to this day. Whether they were ever spoken is a matter now that historians debate. And who were the Panfilovцы? It's open now, particularly when the Soviets later, the Soviet police, later discovered that not all of the Panfilovцы died. In fact, some of them were recaptured in German-occupied territory. Very murky, dark stories were unraveled in the paranoia of the post-war period. But does it really matter, ultimately? For historians, yes. And these are things that they can explore and have explored on blogs to great depth. Who were the Panfilovцы? Were they really what they were supposed to be, what we were told they were? But nonetheless, something happened. Why not create a memorial or sustain a memorial which is an emblem of that miracle that took place in November and December of 1941. Now, here you see photographs that I took in the summer of 2012 and in 2013. The 2013 have not yet been reworked in Photoshop, but I brought them in anyway. This is the site of the railroad junction at Duboseko. That means clearing in the oaks. And here you can see this 1970s memorial in a very different style. You see these monoliths rising of huge size. There's later on you'll see a photograph of the human figure. You can see how enormous they are, 50 feet high. Yeah, there's the human figure there. Concrete. I say that there's an influence here of Easter Island, where they rise from the ground. The style is similar to Bacevich's later style. He didn't do this monument. but it was sort of the canonical style. One can see the style of that memorial, and it bears more than a passing resemblance to the work of Arno Breker. Is that a name that anyone knows here? Yeah. Well, the sculptor of the Third Reich, who apparently was later, Stalin so admired his work that, and perhaps it's an apocryphal story, that he was actually offered very well remunerated employment for the Soviet regime. And he is supposed to have sardonically replied, no, one dictator is enough. But there is something of this monumental script classicism heroic form rising out of the earth. 6 figures representing the 6 nationalities. This is 1970s Soviet idealism that composed the group of Soviet soldiers that in this desperate resistance. And you can see in the mass grave nearby, that's the general component of the soldiers. There's the red star in front of it. Just views of they're holding these bunched grenades that were supposed to blow off the tank treads. They're pointing, they're taking the oath, they're holding the Spagan guns in front of them, submachine guns, taking the oath to die. And there's the one looking, the one that our designer here at Reed so beautifully worked into the poster today. There it is. I'll just leave it there. I know Professor Lenchett wanted the poster to be on the podium. So, looking toward the west, alert, ready to die. Who were these people? Does it really matter now? Groups and other groups at that time, and this place and other places along that line to the west of Moscow did indeed stand the death. And the German tank wedges were blunted. Many parts of that story have been told. Other parts are lost in the fog of war. Here's the mass grave near that monument, and you can see that in memory, in the people's memory, your deed is immortal. In the people's memory, your deed is immortal. Памяти народной подвиг ваш бессмертен. 1941, and we can go around to the other side of that memorial, and we can see the names. Yes, there they are. They're the names of 28 Brumfield, as it was canonically recorded in that first article on Truska Svezda in December 1941, and it's still left. But it seems to be an abandoned memorial to a certain extent. Because of the historical controversy, there's a little museum nearby. I've been to that museum on more than one occasion. It's always closed. It has the hours there. You can photograph the hours. When I asked it's in the Sel-Sovet, the village Soviet, and I asked the woman in the next office, said, наверное, вышли на обед. They probably went out for lunch. It's one of those Russian interminable lunch breaks. And what else are they going to say? A few photographs and so forth. And I think the historical controversy is something of a cloud over this entire complex. But it is effective, it is meaningful, because it represents something that in whatever form, whatever the specifics, did take place in the fall, a desperate fall of panic, sacrifice, of despair, when it seemed that no line would hold the Germans. Something held. People disregarded their own lives, their own safety, to hold that line against the dreaded and vaunted Wehrmacht. The great Battle of Moscow at the end of 1941. And just nearby, I wanted to show you, this is the town of Istra. Everywhere you can drive in any direction in this part of Russia. 15 miles, 20 miles, and you come to a memorial. This is a memorial to the Opolchensi, the people who had no army training and enrolled right on the spot out of enthusiasm. Many of them were students. They were massacred. Massacred. And this also applies in the desperate days of fall 1941 and the South approaches to Petersburg. They had very little training. in many cases given a gun that wouldn't fire, or they didn't know how to fire it. But they laid their lives on the line. Here's a list. See how many names there are? It's just from a small place. Now, I gave to Professor Lenchik a reference to an article that recently appeared in the New Yorker by a regular contributor to the New Yorker on cultural issues, Louis Menon, who's professor of English at Harvard. It's a review of a recent book by Anne Applebaum about how the Soviets oppressed all sorts of, any sort of a civil society in Eastern Europe during the years following the defeat of Germany. All of that is true, and all of that needs to be told. But I read one sentence at the beginning of that review. I don't have the text here to quote, but it doesn't really matter. You can find it. It's available on the internet. And going into his really retelling of Anne Applebaum's book, there's one sentence. But the tide, the Germans were stopped before Moscow. And then we get into the atrocities committed by the Red Army. Well, those atrocities did indeed exist. Many people have spoken and written about them. But who stood against the Wehrmacht in 1941? Who stood against them? History does not unfold according to the theoreticians who say, as Hannah Arendt first did in Origins of Totalitarianism, that essentially there was no difference, or the Soviet and the Hitler regime were very similar. All of these points deserve to be made, but history unfolds in a sequence of specific moments. And in the fall of 1941, there was only one task: to stop Hitler's armies. Our own nation, as you know, was divided. The recent magisterial biography of Joseph Kennedy shows that he, our ambassador to England, actually wanted the British to give up. Roosevelt was a far shrewder and more intelligent person, knew that eventually the Soviets would have to be enlisted in this battle. But America was far away, no matter what America's intentions. Someone had to stand, someone had to die, and these are the people who did it. In many cases, they were simply massacred. The Germans themselves actually used the term massacre of the innocents in their cheerful, insouciant way. And I think finally the Germans now are admitting the complicity and culpability of the Wehrmacht in some of the worst crimes on the Eastern Front. And the passions of the Cold War, that was overlooked in Western historiography. That the Army's hands were clean. Well, the atrocities were those of the SS. Nonsense. Not only did the German professional, superbly trained army enable the atrocities, but in many cases directly participate in them, including the massive killing of Jewish populations. We have then this 1970s late Soviet idealistic commemoration of the stand in front of Moscow in November and October of 1941. Now I'd like to go to the more recent memorial that I have photographed, and we can call it the PostSoviet Memorial, at the field of Bogorodiskaya Polya. Takes its name from the state of Bogorodisk, which means Mother of God. Here's the church dedicated to the icon of the Mother of God. Excuse me, Nativity of the Mother of God. It's the state church from the late 1780s, and was at the site that one of the breakouts by a few thousand troops from the Vyazma encirclement occurred. The Orthodox Church has now nearby begun the construction of a convent which will be dedicated to the memory of those who died in this exalted sacrifice. This is a new stage. The Orthodox Church moving into the commemoration of the sacrifices, the losses during the Second World War. Here we can see the interior of the 18th century church, which was of course closed, vandalized. This is another state church right nearby from the 1830s. It's been restored as a museum, but the main church, the Church of the Nativity of the Mother of God has been cleaned but not restored. It was vandalized during the Soviet period and then swept over during the, these are the photographs that I took primarily in the summer of August 2012. So that is the center of the historical field of battle, part of the Vyazma encirclement. But now we can go to what has been placed on the site. And this is the village of Martuki, 5 kilometers away from that church that we just saw. And here is what's called a skeet. In Russian monasticism, that's a retreat, not a full-fledged monastery, but a retreat for monks. Here you can see the bell gable. We'll see a little bit more about that as I bring up a site that they've created. You can see here a Father Daniel, who is the the monk who's managing the establishment of the monastery. And there is Matushka Angelina, Mother Angelina, who is the prioress, who will be the prioress of the convent. And do you recognize who else is in the photograph with Mother Angelina? Kirill. At that time, the Bishop of Smolensk, the Metropolitan of Smolensk. Metropolitan is above the bishop. It's a major party. He is, as I think you now know, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it is, as the Russians say, не случайно, it's not accidental, that this process of commemoration, memorialization, is occurring on the grounds of the eparchy, the former eparchy of the current leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. There are many other influences playing on this selection, but this is certainly not accidental. This is early 1990s, before he was appointed patriarch. You can already see him involved, engaged in this process, which led to the founding of the skeet, whose photographs that I've just been showing you, and we can go back. At Martuki, a site on which a mortar detachment was killed, the last man, and that is commemorated in the tablet in front of this little chapel. All right, so if we go to the photographs of the skeet, here you see the chapel itself. And we can go on the inside. And at first, Father Daniel said, can I photograph the interior of this chapel, this memorial chapel? Here it is. And he said, no, не разрешаю, не благословляю. I don't give my blessing. And then my friend who was with me, a friend from Moscow, said, oh, Father Daniel, maybe you can ready. And then he relented, and in the typical Russian way. Not only did he relent, but he looked at my view display and said, you know, you can take this a little bit better. Maybe you should stand back. You can't do it. Here, let me show you how you can do it even better. It's dedicated to St. Theodore Stratilates, a warrior saint in Byzantine hagiography, a Roman soldier who accepted Christianity, was martyred for the faith. St. Theodore Stratilates, martyr, warrior, saint. I think you see the connection. And there are various flags of local police detachments and internal detachment troops and army troops. There's Father Daniel there ringing the bells in the evening. So clearly there is a sense of establishing ties with what the Russians call the silovые структуры, the forces that every nation has to maintain its laws. This is the interior of the cabin where I live, the izba, where I stayed during my time there. So yeah, let's put that out front. And I think we can see it even more clearly if we go to another site here. And we can see some of the reburial of bodies that have been dug up on the site of Bogorodiskaya Polya, within the shadow of that chapel that I just shown you. You can see that everywhere, and this terrain, which is marshy terrain. It's a nightmare terrain. It bogs everywhere. Rusted helmets, kaski in Russian. And you can see they dig up fragments of bones. There's actually an ossuary on the territory of this scheme. And they put them in coffins, and they put some of these rusted helmets on top of the coffins. And then they are reburied. You can see the veterans here gathered. This was about 3 years ago when this site was done. You can see clearly the troops in the background there. You can see this attempt by the church to establish we belong here. We belong with you in this commemoration of the sacrifice of Russian soldiers. The church is now putting, as are other religions, chaplains into certain detachments in the army. It's a very cautious process. But there is, I will admit right now, an agenda in all of this. You'll notice, by the way, the Orthodox crosses on the coffins. Again, these were people who could not have gone to Orthodox or been practicing Orthodox. But it's all part of that Russian sacrifice. Now we get to the other part of the memorial, which coexists with that, the state memorial, and we can see how these two fuse. One other thing that I wanted to show you, these are the project drawings for the convent. It shows where the troops broke out. Again, you can see the military personnel right there. This was taken about 5 years ago at this site. So you can see the way the church is going to affect through this memorialization, the process of rapprochement with the current Russian armed forces. That we belong with you, that we support you. One of the most striking examples of that is the icon that I saw within the church. Let me show it to you right here. I don't know whether the church has sanctioned this. Extraordinary. This was in the little chapel that I just showed you of Theodore Sterkilides. Remarkable icon. The Mother of God in the adjectria form. She's holding a Christ child and pointing to the Christ as the Savior. And what do we see at the bottom? Rank upon rank, thousands and thousands of souls, without arms, of course. They're not armed. But they are ascending toward the figure of the Mother of God. This exaltation of the hundreds of thousands that were slaughtered under conditions of the most utter despair and chaos in 1941 and in 1942. Reminds some of those photographs of Russian prisoners marching into German captivity. You've probably seen some of them. Again, the endless masses of a formerly effective army, now moving up. The Lord's hosts, now part of the exaltation, under the aegis of the Russian Orthodox Church. It is a very interesting phenomenon. I expect it to continue. It has its own contradictions, and one can be indeed skeptical of it in certain ways. We can go back again to Martucci, a couple of other views that I wanted to show you of the commemorative crosses there. This commemorates the mortar detachment that was killed. It's a hooded cross, traditional Orthodox form, commemorating Soviet troops who were lost in the terrible encirclement of October 1941. Now, I would like to just move from what we could say a little bit more about the 1990s memorial, which is now part of the Griboyedov estate, the Khmelnytsia, is under their museum. And you can see the rusted kaski, or helmets, that are placed there on the site of these tombstones, which represents entire divisions which were lost in this encirclement. And not even in names, simply the numbers of the divisions. You see there's a spade and an entrenching tool. I've talked with people there who spoke with witnesses. The Germans advanced so quickly that the Soviets who were trying to retreat actually found themselves storming their own defensive trenches. You understand what's happening? They dig a defensive line, expecting to fall back to it, the Germans are already in that line. When the Germans, in the spring of 1943, knew that they would have to retreat, they enlisted local villagers to rebury some of the dead. In some cases, the bodies were stacked 7 feet deep. Another interesting detail that came out. In October 1941, the Germans didn't stay around. They immediately went on. They left minimal forces to police this area. The peasants were trying to survive. You know what they found? Hundreds of horses, draft horses, left from the smithereens, the smashed gun carriages. Remember, both the German and the Russian armies at this time, even in 1941, were primarily horse-drawn armies. The tank divisions were an exception. So there were all of these. Of course, we saw the rather sentimental Steven Spielberg film. What was he called? War Horse? One horse caught between the lines. There were hundreds of horses. The peasants, of course, tried, in their survival instincts, to take whatever they could. Whatever the occupier they needed to survive. Those horses were simply, those that weren't killed, of course, were simply there to be taken. So we can see in this ground the relics of the Terra, the Hara, and here you can see the State Memorial, next to the new convent. Incidentally, there is a predecessor for this, the convent that was founded on the great Borodino battlefield that Tolstoy described from War and Peace in the 1860s. The widow of one of the generals killed in that battle, 1850s, established with her means a convent. It exists to this day. It is the Savior Borodino convent. So there's a clear parallel with the earlier Fallerland War. Now they're creating a new Savior Bogoroditskaya, Mother of God convent, clearly analogous to the Borodino battlefield and the struggle with Napoleon in the fall of 1812. So all of these tie-ins, all of these analogies that bring the church into the picture of commemoration in today's Russia. We go to the previous 1990s, secular memorial. We see here a granite monolith with words by the soldier's poet Andrei Tarkovsky, which are essentially a paraphrase of Horace's famous "Et dulce et nobile por patria more." It is noble and sweet to die for one's fatherland. There was nothing noble and sweet about the deaths of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were trapped in this encirclement. So there's a sort of false piety here. The church is moving in with its attempt to commemorate in a different way. It is a process that I think will continue. But in every village, and again, we see these memorials. I'd like to fade out with a view. A village near, some of my friends have a small house in the southern part of Moscow province. It's called Savino. And once again, we see the, if we can get back here, excuse me, your patience, yes, Savino. Yes. An enormous church built at the beginning of the 20th century. It was, of course, immediately closed by the Soviets. And we see a memorial form there over to the right. Yes, not clear exactly what it is. It turns out to be it's a billowing cloak, oilcloth cloak behind the soldier standing with his submachine gun. Yeah, there it is. It's dedicated to a hero of the Soviet Union, a certain Ivan Gromyhalin. Was born in the early 1920s, worked in a shoe factory in this little town of nowhere, Yegorevsk. And this is the village of Savino next to it. And he was killed in Pomerania in the spring of 1945 as an engineer ferrying troops across that last great river in Wasakovsky's northern sweep into Germany. He was shot, but he went back to the bank on the opposite side of the river and continued to ferry troops. He shot again. Died, was posthumously given the order of hero of the Soviet Union. You can see that order represented. But what's even more fascinating, all of the names you villages, and it's just from a small, many of these villages no longer exist. Dozens of names, people who were lost. Each of those lives, I would argue, is meaningful. The notion that the Russians held life cheaply are, I think, deeply offensive. No matter what Stalin or Zhukov thought, each of those lives was meaningful on its own terms. And for those who criticize, and certainly with good cause, what the Soviet army ultimately did in Europe, an army that in many ways bore oppression, you need to remember what happened in 1941, 1942. For that matter, why were the Russians even at the gates of Warsaw in 1944? Enormous organizational and logistical effort in order to get that German army on the Eastern Front smashed. And we so often forget about that. And when people would refer to that as though the army was an automaton, a machine, in many ways it was, but it was made up of individuals such as Ivan Gromyko. Well, of course, being Russia, there are, these are my photographs again from the summer of 2012. There are these interesting and odd juxtapositions. Because next to the memorial and the abandoned church, what do we see? Sport bar, if you're just reading the signs there, billiards, discotheque. Well, why not? Why not? Here it is, this sort of pathetic, shabby little community, but it too has its monument, its memorial in a secular form, but with church as a backdrop. So the Russians are now sorting these issues out, and I suppose it is appropriate now to again remind us of what is at stake, or what was at stake. I referred to Gordon Horwitz's book, Ghetto Stadt, which showed that even in 1940, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans had already implemented an exterminationist policy as a part of their occupation. The city of Łódź, renamed Litzmannstadt. The book is beautifully researched, written, it's published by Harvard University Press, Gordon Horwitz, H-O-R-W-I-T-Z. It's called Ghetto Stadt. And it deals with some very painful and controversial issues, including those raised by Hannah Arendt and Eichmann in Jerusalem, namely the role played by the leader of the Jewish Council, Chaim Arunkovsky. So that what happened in Łódź is one of the saddest episodes that one can imagine, the terrifying brutality with which that ghetto was eliminated over the years, including the request that all of the people give their children who were shipped off to Auschwitz. But you continue to work for us. We're not going to pay, we're not going to provide your useless children with food. Give them to Auschwitz. This happened. It's an entire chapter. It's called Give Us Your Children. Because Arunkovsky was the person who had to make that announcement. This ultimate refined cruelty of the occupation policy. And this is one example. And who liberated what was left of the Łódź ghetto, less than 1,000 people. It was, of course, the Red Army at the beginning of 1945. This is what is at stake, but something else. And I discovered this past summer. Friends with an apartment near the Park Pobєdy, Victory Park in the south part of Petersburg. And it's been rebuilt, they're refurbishing it now or renovating it, whatever one does with a park. And I started walking around the camera, and this is something I hadn't seen before. A local entrepreneur whose parents survived the siege heard that in dredging the pond, they brought up this wheeled carriage. Now, in the 1930s, before the war, there was a brick kiln on this site. There were large ovens. The bricks were fed into the ovens on these iron carriages. And we usually think of the siege of Petersburg and the massacre of almost 1 million people died inside the city. It's not even talking about battle deaths. You think about the Piskaryovo cemetery to the north of the city. Perhaps some of you have been there. The people were buried. Most of them were not buried. After the worst winter of 1941-42, when the thaw begins, what is the main concern? Epidemics. The bodies were, in fact, and this was for a long time not talked about, they were taken by the tens of thousands to this former brick kiln, were loaded onto these carriages, and fed into the ovens. This is the way to deal with the terrible threat of epidemic, decomposing bodies. So this entrepreneur decided this will be a memorial. You see the granite pediment there is in the form, as it were, almost of rails, iron rails. You can see the people have put the bouquets on the carriage. Let's get another view of it from the other angle. Yes, right here. Tens of thousands of people. And of course, the horrible irony, horrifying irony, that this was happening in Auschwitz and Treblinka for totally different reasons. Totally different reasons. But only recently now has this been publicly commemorated and acknowledged. The cremation of those civilians who died during the siege of Leningrad. We all know what was at stake. But sometimes there are moments like this that fix it in memory. The church is playing its role, citizens are playing their role. They are opening pages that have heretofore been suppressed or ignored, partly out of shame, partly out of a sense of culpability. They too are a part of the new process of coming to terms and at the same time remembering what happened on the Eastern Front, on the territory of the Soviet Union during the years 1941 to the final defeat of the Third Reich. I think I will conclude my presentation with this image. Perhaps there are questions. Certainly there are things that need to be discussed in this, or should be, or could be discussed in the new Russian commemorative approaches to sacrifices of the Second World War. And perhaps you would be willing to share your own thoughts with me on this subject. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Please.
It's my understanding that Stalin made peace is not really even the right word, almost like begged the church to come along and help when things were falling apart. So isn't some of what's currently happening trying to reclaim their place?
Yeah, I think that is a very appropriate point. There wasn't a rapprochement with the Russian Orthodox Church during the Stalinist period. Paradoxically, it was Khrushchev who reinstated the persecution. The de-Stalinists also reinvigorated the attacks on the church, because this was seen to be the final battle before the triumph of socialism. So that there's actually, in comparison to the late Stalinist period, the attacks on the church were actually intensified during the Khrushchev period. But I think there certainly is that link. This notion that the church was an ally. We know that church parishes paid for tanks. There's the famous Alexander Nevsky tank column that was paid for by church donations. So clearly, these are enormously complicated issues. And people still, to this day, feel very strongly on each side. Was the Soviet regime an oppressor of the church? To a certain extent, it certainly was. There were many Orthodox who fled with the Germans, particularly from Latvia, the end of 1944 and 1945. One of the most fascinating was the story of the Tikhvin icon of the Mother of God, which was taken out by Bishop John from Latvia. He was presiding under the Germans, a Russian Orthodox community, who essentially wanted to have nothing to do with the Soviet regime. That icon ended up in Chicago. But Bishop John left it now, letting you know that when the Soviet regime was no longer in place, when Russian people had turned to God, he wanted the icon to go back. And there's a very interesting story told by his grandson, an adopted son, his grandson, Father John Garklops, Alexander Garklops, excuse me, who accompanied the icon back to the Tikhvin Monastery, which is in Leningrad province. It's still called Leningrad province, despite the fact that St. Petersburg was in it. And you can, thousands of pilgrims go to see that icon every year. It's an object of veneration. So that the complexity of these issues is enormous. And one can find shady characters as well as heroes on every side of the story. Perhaps there are other observations you would like to make about the role of the church in this process. Yes?
Following up on that, in the Orthodox retreat that was the Chechen Memorial, I was kind of curious what the wording on those monuments were as regard to the fallen Russian soldiers.
Yeah. For example, the hooded cross, the votive cross, it is simply a matter of, in a very brief way, a very succinct way, the members of such and such a mortar squad perished on this site. It gives the sort of report of the day. But it's on the cross.
Not taking a side, really.
No.
Just saying they died here.
Yes, but it's obviously that these were our sacrifices. It doesn't say that they were Christians, but they did put a plaque on you saw the place where it resides. So this is now all a part, and the icon is the ultimate expression of that. And I don't think that's really a canonical icon, just between you and me. It works in that setting, but I don't think the church is widely distributing this icon with the souls of the Russians who are Soviets. They weren't all Russians. They were Soviets. Yeah. So I think there are many different ways in which one can, you're generalizing here. Do they have the right to generalize? I sort of sympathize with their position. The one thing that I thought about was recently, the Mormon Church tried to, what was that famous episode, very controversial, about 2 years ago, to claim someone retroactively who was not Christian. You remember that episode? But that was a specific person who they were trying to exalt for their own purposes. This is a much larger, unspecified notion that all Russians share a memory of this sacrifice, and it is a holy obligation to remember that sacrifice.
Following up on that, do they commemorate Germans anywhere in Russia?
The point is, it's been made, and that's why you see these reburial brigades that have been going on. The German military cemeteries on the territory of Russia are much better kept. The Germans have been sending groups over there for decades. And I think this became also an object of shame and confusion. So in many ways, the Russians simply did not. It was an inconvenient topic. Why were so many lost? Now I think they've got enough distance there. We need to revere those. So you have these groups each summer who go out, in many cases young volunteers, who spend their time digging up the remains and choosing them to rebury. In many cases, you no longer have any identifying on the body, yes. There is this symbolic notion that we need to care for our own dead. If the Germans can do it on our own soil, why have we not done it?
Have they always done it, or only since the fall of the Soviet Union?
No. They were allowed to come into territory around Stalingrad before the fall of the Soviet Union. Oh, yes. Well, certainly with the rapprochement after the Adenauer with the rapprochement between Russia and well, not only the East, but also Western Germany. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But you're right, the East factor is also. So if they're letting people in from the East, ultimately they let in from the West because they're paying their own money. Yes, that's another. Yeah.
I don't feel like or perceive that there's anything unusual in the cultural undertones that you've been speaking about. That I think they're generalizing and seem to be culturally worldwide, history-wide. I mean, I feel like we do that daily with our World Series and football memorializations and day-to-day honoring the troops, and it's just part of the same.
Well, but it also goes into this other process, and I mentioned that Russia saved Europe from the Mongol invasion. But it was also 1812. Napoleon, having conquered the continent, was ultimately defeated at huge cost at the threshold of Moscow. So that it's a part of a myth that can now be extended into the Second World War without overt political contentiousness. We're not going to offend our German colleagues that the Russian Orthodox Church exalts the souls of those who perished. And that's a new twist. So that it's no longer, these passions are very, very slow to fade. And as we see recently, nationalism is still very much a force in Europe. Polish nationalists defaced the Russian embassy. The Polish president just publicly apologized 2 days ago. Russian nationalists are demonstrating.
Well, if you saw the Times today or yesterday, there was a front-page story about Vilnius, the monuments to heroic workers and soldiers on the bridge across the river in Vilna, which were erected by the occupying Soviet Army. And now the great debate is, should they be preserved or should they be dismantled as part of the memory of a particular historical episode. Right?
Very good. But see, the Baltic thing is complicated by the fact that some Baltic organizations, public organizations, are now supporting as heroes their own people who served in Baltic SS units. Mm-hmm. Now you say, well, they were Waffen SS. They weren't concentration camp guards, but this gets very, very cloudy and very messy very quickly. And there was a statue to General Chernyakhovsky, the only general of field rank general of Jewish origin. 1991, soon thereafter, I'll take the statue down. They're going to melt it down. And there was an entrepreneur in Voronezh, where way heck out in southwest Russia, where the Germans were plunging ahead in 1942, said, Chernyakhovsky stopped the Germans, played a major role in pushing the Germans back to Voronezh. We're going to put his statue outside the train. I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to bring it from Lithuania and put it there. Jewish general, and you could say that he did liberate Vilnius. Or was it just an imposition of another regime? He was there to fight. What happens after is a part of an enormously complex political process. Well, I'm very pleased that they did preserve the memorial to General Chernyakhovsky. And when I was in Voronezh a few years ago working, the people there were so amazed that I knew who Chernyakhovsky was. And they did a big story on my work there, a whole page in a local newspaper. And I photographed on the background of that statue, which is right outside the train station in Voronezh. And I do think he was an extraordinary commander. He died leading his troops. He led from the front in the attack in East Prussia in the spring of 1945. An extraordinarily gifted young commander, and Jewish, from a Jewish working class family. These people need to be remembered. They did an extraordinary thing on the Eastern Front. So that there are all sorts of, but of course the people whose families were exiled, Balts, Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, exiled to Siberia. It's enormous, and these issues don't seem to be going away anytime soon. In fact, the further the distance from the historical event, the more impassioned the debates get. A lot of them have to do with all of these wars that occurred within the larger war, sometimes with even greater ferocity and brutality. It's something that we should discuss. But I go back. Who stood in the fall of 1941? That is my point. Memorialization there is really the issue that I wish to add to this conversation. Yes.
Well, I think you just answered my question, which was going to be what you think the prospects are for a sort of trans entity understanding or appreciation of what went on in these areas. When I think of the many sorts of victims who ought to be memorialized, let's say those who died of famine because of the German occupation. Yes. I understand the Russian army had a unit that photographed the sites of the massacres of Jews. Yeah. And then there are the victims of the Stalinist regime in various. So let's imagine everybody made their memorials. Would it be possible that they would get to your mental state where you see the big picture?
Well, I'm bringing this to a Western public. I mean, after all, I live in this country. I'm a citizen. I was educated here. I traveled perhaps in Russia more than any other American. I've documented that. I've got the support of the Library of Congress. I'm bringing thanks to Professor Lenchek. I'm bringing this to audiences such as you. And speaking of this, let's go back, because we so often dismiss what happened at a particular sequence. Victimization is an endless issue. But at a specific sequence, who stood between the Wehrmacht and the implementation of Hitler's designs? And remember that, please. Those of you, not you, but those who would be very quick to point to the obvious totalitarian, these people were not ciphers. They were not a political force. They were individuals, and in many cases they died under conditions of unimaginable, appalling brutality. And I'm very happy, by the way, back to your question, that 3 years ago, I'm happy, I'm pleased, I think it's very appropriate that the Holocaust Museum in Washington had an exhibit, a major exhibit, dedicated to the exterminationist policy of the killing, mass killing of Soviet POWs in German camps. And the facile reply, oh, well, Stalin didn't sign the convention, the Geneva Convention. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The Germans were still obligated to provide certain minimal conditions. We think that perhaps as close to 60% of Soviet POWs died, either on forced marches to concentration camps or in concentration camps. 60%.
Yeah, I should mention that anyone who's interested, there is a video that I got at Mauthausen in Austria, which is one of the places that really soldiers of all sorts died. Evidently, Americans died within days. Things were so dreadful at that camp. And there are some pictures of Russian soldiers that the Americans who liberated the camp encountered. It's just staggering.
Yeah,
and they basically started.
Well, there's one other book that I wanted to refer to you, and it's by the professor of the history of war at Oxford University, Richard J. Evans, called The Third Reich at War. The Third Reich at War. It's written from a German perspective, but extraordinary. It's about a Polish doctor who saw October 1941 witnessed a column of 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war passing through the city. He was shocked by what he saw. They all looked like skeletons, just shadows of human beings, barely moving. I've never in my life seen anything like this. This is a Polish doctor. His memoirs have been published now in English. Klukowski, Zygmunt Klukowski. Men were falling to the street. The stronger ones were carrying others, holding them up by the arms. They looked like starving animals, not like people. They were fighting for scraps of apples in the gutter, not paying any attention to the Germans who would beat them and rubber truncheons. Some crossed themselves and knelt, begging for food. Crossed themselves and knelt, begging for food. Soldiers from the convoy beat them without mercy. They beat not only prisoners, but also people, Poles, who stood by and tried to pass them some food. After the macabre unit passed by, several horse-drawn wagons carried prisoners who were unable to walk. This unbelievable treatment of human beings is only possible under German ethics. But this is what we do in passion. Again, Germany now, as we know, is a positive force in Europe. But these issues are still so painful. And to forget, in talking about other, no less painful issues of the legacy of that war and the Stalinist regime, is to forget what had to happen and what did happen in 1941 and 1942. Yes.
I'd love to.
I would love to have you continue, and I would be so happy to actually leave you here for a moment. I have to run to the library where the opening's about to happen. My students are waiting for me. However, Professor Brumfield can stay here. Rose, if you can shepherd Professor Brumfield, because there's so many interesting, important things to discuss.
I'm afraid that, by the way, in the passion of my presentation, I may have faded out of it. Was I supposed to stand in one place?
Not at all.
The opening, we can attend that. We can go over.
You are so invited to.
Okay.
Please. Thank you. So if you'd like to take a few more minutes, then.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm really curious what your take on the controversy around the commemoration of the bombing of Dresden is right now. Speaking of ethics.
Well, you know, there was a very interesting, you know Dyson Freeman?
Mm-hmm.
He writes for the New York Review Books, professor of physics, retired from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. A very interesting statement recently in an article in New York Review Books on asymmetrical warfare. Toward the end, he writes, the German army was defeated by the Russians and the Americans. But German militarism, and this is in about 3 paragraphs long, because previously the Germans had fought the wars on other people's territory during the 20th century. German militarism was extirpated, whatever his word was, vanquished, if you like, by what was obviously a campaign of terror bombing, Terrorangriffen in German. And the British public supported this. So that's his take. That now Germany and Japan, and many people would disagree with it very heatedly. There was no justification for the innocent, many of them refugees, some of them Slavs, by the way, for that. But I don't know. How would you react to a statement like that? That ultimately it took more than a military defeat.
I mean, my reaction to that is all wars are banker wars. I mean, from my perspective, World War II was a banker war, that I think the Russian people realized that they were being sacrificed for nothing. And, which is why so many Russians went to fight with the Germans and left and deserted. Yeah. And that's, the whole Stalinist thing had been propped up by the West and in Germany. What was going on here? Who was financing both sides? I mean, all these people are dying. What are they dying for?
Well, I don't know. You can't unravel it that way, in my opinion, because basically the armed forces had their own logic, and they were the enablers, and they, of course, were financed,
right.
But they weren't asking at a certain point the people who were already at their mercy. Well, what should we do with you? It was pretty obvious. We want to get rid of you. You're garbage. We have a right to kill you, and you're stupid to resist. That was, in fact, the attitude of a racist-based ideology, and it was a racist-based ideology. Yes.
I'd like to sort of return to some of what you were saying earlier, because you were saying that this is coming to terms with this sort of memorializing all the war dead. Well, lots of people do that. We do that. Here, our struggle goes the other way. We're trying to keep religion out of it, pretty much. But what you're saying is that in Russia, the church is sort of attaching itself to this whole movement really is, I think, a way of gaining wide acceptance and sort of taking the role that you would expect the government to do.
Well, the government is in a certain way already compromised by this, but certainly you can argue that the government is ultimately perfectly content with this.
Yeah, I think that they're seeing the church provides them with a useful tool, and the church finds the government a useful tool, and I think I don't know. I think that's all part of the discussion that should be brought out. I would say what I'm coming from is that these sacrifices need to be commemorated, and those who talk about one thing without dealing with the situation. And it's an emotional thing, and I think it's been building up in me as I photograph war memorials. I've made a project of it. I just do it. It's a part of the other work I do, which is photographing architectural monuments. But all of these memorials, and suddenly it was just traversing that ground that Horwitz, Mother of God field there, and how terrible and how terrifying it still is. The memory of it is a field of death. At least, does anybody care? And who cares? And then we can sort of sort out the motives. I think what's very frustrating in the West is how little we understand. We benefited enormously from what happened, and we provided enormous help through Lend-Lease, but it was material for blood. It was. The Russians didn't pay. They say, well, that's the way their generals fought. Well, who had a better solution? We couldn't even get out of Normandy for 6 weeks until the U.S. Air Force blasted Army Air Force at that time, simply pulverized the Germans at Cannes. So that it's not a simple matter to defeat a very well-trained and equipped army. And to the end of the war, I would argue that no army was superior unit for unit to the German, to the Wehrmacht. They had the experience, they had the training, they had the cohesion. Every one of them swore an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. They bought into the whole thing. And you know what the ultimate irony is? Toward the end, first it was Lebensraum. We are the conquerors. Lebensraum. But then, when they started getting defeated in 1943, Goebbels changes it. We are the defenders of Western civilization. At the time when they're still shipping hundreds of thousands of people to death camps. We are defending Western civilization against the Bolsheviks. The most appalling distortion. Yes?
I wanted to thank you for the slide of the rather well-fed Russian soldiers on their knees.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a period when I couldn't even speak of a Russian scientist in my class, or I was sent to the office.
Oh.
And it was a time when all the churches were being closed and people weren't allowed to worship, and now to see them on their knees.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yes. It's interesting. I have a very good friend of mine is a priest who occasionally speaks with naval officers. But still, the military people there are a little bit edgy about getting chaplains in. Why? Because the Russian church has this policy of, you accept suffering. That's not what you want to go into battle with. So there's a sort of edgy meeting in this, but thank you for your insight.
So, I've been to a lot of Rostock, and I've seen World War II memorials there.
Yeah.
That's a super important thing for the Russians. But I think it's interesting. I want to ask you: do you think there's always been this undertone of sense of orthodoxy within the culture, or is it them trying to move into maybe a vacuum created by the?
I think it depends on the segment of the population, but I think it's a two-way street.
Because we would be traveling in the country, and I'd see these churches being built in these very small villages, and I'd ask, is the locals that are having these churches built? And they would tell me, no, that's being built by foreign money. And so it was an interesting question to me. So you think it's more of them attempting to co-op maybe that maybe vacuum they feel? I'm not sure.
I don't know. The local villages have their churches from various means, and they can't afford to pay for them themselves, but it is at least a cohesive port for villages. That's a sort of another question, but there is an undercurrent in large parts of the Russian society.